Welcome to Grownfolk Talk with Patrice. It is good to have you, and I'm happy to be here. So today's topic is a little somber than it normally is, and we're talking today about managing grief. Grief is a beast. All of us at some point in our lives have lost a loved one, and at some point in our lives we will lose people we love. And so for me, I can't make grief make sense. So some of you will know that I lost my twin brother a few years ago. He died 9 months before our 50th birthday. And that was a huge lesson to me. I had lost people I loved before, but to lose my twin brother really opened my eyes to the beast that grief is. And I couldn't wrap my head around it. I couldn't make it make sense. And I feel like grief almost took me out. And so when I think about how people lose people every day, and people have to deal with grief every day, and we will always lose people we love and always have to deal with grief. So we're talking today about managing grief, riding the grief roller coaster, because grief comes in waves, it comes in periods, and it comes when we least expect it. And a lot of times we don't know how to deal with it. And here we are almost 11 years later, and I still have times when I fall apart thinking about my brother, or remembering something that we did, or just the fact that he's not here. I turned 60 in August. And when I think that my brother would have been turning 60, he deserved to be 60. And that broke my heart more so than my feelings, just knowing that he's gone and won't celebrate a birthday again. So we're dealing with grief in different ways many times. So I have asked my friend, someone who we all know and love, to join me today, because one of the questions I have is dealing, some people handle grief better than others. And is that a facade, or are people just, it is what it is, it's a part of life? And the truth of the matter is, grief is a part of life, but how do we manage it? How do we ride the roller coaster? So it is my pleasure to have on the show with me today someone, as I said, we know and love, Dr. Gina Spence-Virgil. I feel like I don't need to introduce her because we know her, but I will. She is a chaplain, a community activist, and a lover of the performing arts. She is also the chief executive officer and founder of Gina Spence Productions, which is a non-profit charity which provides community outreach programs to at-risk families in Bermuda. An advanced grief recovery specialist certified by the Grief Recovery Institute, Gina has been providing grief and loss support to children and adults through the GSP Champions program. She is also a proud mother, grandmother, and wife to Ronald Virgil. Dr. Gina Spence-Virgil, welcome, my darling.
Good day, my friend. It's
hello.
Good to be here.
Oh, it's certainly good to have you here. I'm glad you are. Mm-hmm. So, despite what we're talking about, there's a lot to be said. There's a lot to be said. And this is somewhere where unfortunately, you have experience as well as expertise in managing grief, in riding the grief roller coaster, the waves that come with it.
Yes.
So let's talk about it. Well, is it your opinion that some people do handle grief better, or are they just pretending that it's okay?
Well, let's talk about what grief is.
Yes.
Grief is actually the normal reaction to losing someone or something dear to you.
Right.
It's most people will respond according to the relationship that they have with that person, the time spent with them,
yes,
and what they do or don't mean to the individual.
Okay.
And so that's why some people, for an example, you may have 2 children in a home and a parent may have passed.
Right.
The son has no relationship with his father, and the daughter is close as can be.
Right.
So when that happens, the son's reaction is going to be completely different from the daughter.
As you said, the relationship that you
is
have.
extremely important.
Right.
And sometimes even how the person dies, you know? I mean, sometimes people have an opportunity, they're given that time to say their goodbyes, and versus somebody you spoke to yesterday and you got home tonight and they're gone.
Right.
You know, sudden death, compounded death. It's just so many different elements and levels to it.
Right.
And we are 100% grievers. Everybody has lost someone or something in their lifetime.
Right.
And grief is individual.
Right.
No two people grieve the same and no two people heal the same.
Right.
And so your question is really an individualized response because everybody
Gotcha.
is different.
Right.
Yeah.
And so then that takes us to how some people may be perceived to be handling it better. Maybe they are perfectly okay with it. As you said, back to relationships. So if you had, well, didn't have a relationship with the person, just because you are a son and daughter or a father and son or whatever the case is, maybe that relationship was tainted or just didn't really exist.
Yeah.
And so then that does affect how we grieve.
Respond. Exactly.
Right.
And more importantly, when you think about grief, now we're talking about the two big ones are death and divorce.
Right.
So most people will familiarize that type of loss with someone dying
Right.
or a couple getting a divorce.
And so and that's interesting because when I hear grief, I think of death.
Yes.
But now that you said that, we grieve loss, period.
Oh,
the loss of a marriage, as you just said.
The loss of a job, the loss of a friendship, the loss of a relationship that was, together for 20 years and somebody decides they don't want to be in a relationship anymore.
Right.
The loss of trust, intangible losses.
Oh, we grieve the loss of trust.
Of course. If someone took your innocence as a child,
Yes.
you never get it back.
Right.
But your trust factors are completely different from someone who has been protected.
Right.
Yeah.
Which carries on to other parts of our lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So grief is accumulative. So if we have this example where we say, for everything you've lost, if I put a big rock in your knapsack and you never dealt with it, so you lost a job,
Right.
you lost a friendship, someone actually died, you lost an opportunity, you wanted to go to school to become a doctor and you got pregnant.
Right.
So
Right.
that's a loss. But if you start to put all those losses in your knapsack, it
As
gets
rocks.
heavy. As rocks. It gets heavy. And we're not taught to, like I said, grief is not a sexy subject. Nobody's signing up to say, I want to talk about grief.
Right.
And most people avoid it rather than talk about it for all sorts of reasons. But the reality is unaddressed grief has some serious consequences.
Unaddressed grief.
Unaddressed grief.
What does unaddressed grief look like? How does it manifest? What does it look like and how does it manifest?
Sure. So in our training, we're taught that we call them starbs. And these are things that we do.
Starbs?
Starbs, S-T-E-R-B-S. These are things that we do so we don't feel the pain. Some of them are negative, some of them are positive.
Okay.
Like we may start working out. There's nothing wrong with working out, but it's insane.
Why are you doing it? Right.
We may do shopping therapy. The person may just shop so they don't have to think about this loss.
Right.
People eat. There are so many
That's
different
probably
things that
big,
do.
right?
People work so they don't have to feel or think about going home to that empty bed or driving past that house where the mortgage was called and
we grieve losing houses.
Absolutely. And I just counseled someone. I think the two saddest stories I've heard was one lady said she's grieving herself.
She's grieving herself.
She's grieving
She lost herself.
She had a stroke. And the person and she was very active. She used to do walking and swimming and she had a stroke and she was no longer able to do the things. So she was grieving the person she used to be. Deeply.
I would have never thought of that, but it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And then another lady said she's grieving someone she's never met. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And she was like, well, I had a child and it was stillborn.
Okay.
So I never
She's grieving.
She's grieving, the loss of carrying a child for 9 months.
Right.
And getting to the point where the child, didn't survive.
Well, that being said, I belong to several groups on Facebook with twins who have lost their twins. And it's such a great support group because sometimes we feel like nobody understands. And so some of them are adult twins who have lost their twins and some of them are, children.
Yeah.
And there are some people whose twin was stillborn or was miscarried before birth, and they said they still feel a sense of loss.
Of course.
And initially, I couldn't understand it until they went on to explain a little more. It's just sometimes they don't even find out till later in life that there was a twin that was conceived with them and growing with them, and but they just feel a void.
Yeah. And that is grief. I mean, you talked about the wave,
Yes.
It comes, sometimes it's a tidal wave.
Yes.
Sometimes it's a gentle wave.
Yes.
Sometimes it's rough.
Right.
You never know when that feeling is going to kick in.
You absolutely don't.
Things just a song could bring it back.
Right.
A meal that you both shared in.
Right.
It could be a color. If the person loves Devonshire coats, orange.
Yes.
Whenever you see it,
you think of that person. Right.
So these are all, like I said, natural responses to loss.
Yes.
And the grieving process is something that if you don't get the help that you need, it will manifest itself in your life in many different ways. I talked to someone as recently as a week ago, and in the work that we do with, men who have lost their lives or people who have lost their lives to gunshot, sometimes when it happens, people don't ask for the help right away.
Right.
Because they're in that space.
Right.
It's shocking. It's, people have to go through the
It's overwhelming.
process.
Right.
And so a year ago, someone we offered the help and they weren't ready yet.
Right.
So you have to wait.
Right.
You have to give them that space and that time, if and when they choose to. And they finally were ready. But when we went to the house, this is like a year later, the watch was still on the dresser, the boots were still on the floor. Okay. Everything was exactly how the person left it that night. And, having to, she was saying, well, I feel like if I start getting rid of his stuff, I'm getting rid of him.
Yes.
And, the training that we do and the type of counseling that we do is specific to grief.
Okay.
So there is a 4-week program that we would do. We do group sessions and we help people it's not like you're just sitting and talking and saying, hi, my name is Gina. I lost a loved one.
Right.
It's work.
Right.
There are things that you have to do in order to come to grips with what has actually happened.
Okay.
But more importantly, you're given tools on how to deal with it.
Right.
Because again, these are not easy things to do. But we've seen people come through on the other side,
Well, that's important because I remember when my brother died, I was working at the Women's Resource Center. And my boss at the time said, if you would like to have counseling, you can see, we had counselors there.
Of course.
And she said, if you'd like to see the counselor, you can, and I did. And I sat with this woman for, I guess, an hour. And 15 minutes in, I was like checked out because I'm not saying she wasn't good at what she did, but my thought was, your twin brother's not in the graveyard. What can you tell me? And so I was so angry anyway. I actually still think I'm very angry. 11 years later, but my anger was to the point where I don't want to hear what you have to say, lady. It's never going to be okay. It's never going to be right. Whatever you're going to say to me is never going to make it better because this is wrong on so many levels. It's just wrong. And I remember checking out mentally. I was like, what time is this going to be over? I didn't want it. And I never went back. I've never been for counseling since then.
And that process, again, and that I believe about the grief recovery program, which is what I was trained in.
Yes.
A gentleman had lost his son. His little boy.
Right.
And he had been to counselor after counselor, person after person. And what he said was they were speaking to him intellectually, but it wasn't his head that hurt.
Right.
It was his heart.
Absolutely. I get it.
The program is designed to deal with your heart and not your head.
Right.
Because the intellectual stuff, like you said, it does nothing for you. And that, if anything at all, it makes you more angry.
Yes.
And just like anything else, any form of change, trying to address something, there have to be steps and it has to be a roadmap.
Yes. Yeah.
So the grief recovery program is based, one, on a person who didn't like the intellectual responses, and two, found a way through dealing with the heart and giving people tools on how to address their grief.
Oh, so that's how it started with someone who was going through grief.
Yes, the gentleman's son.
Oh, who lost a little boy.
Yeah, and he was a very wealthy person. And like I said, he had been to some of the best in the world.
Right.
But it was all, he said they spoke to my head.
Right.
He said, but my heart was hurting.
Yes.
So he did a lot of research with a few universities. And the grief recovery program is I know of a few other types of programs, but the grief recovery program is the largest grief support system in the world. They have grief recovery specialists all over the planet. So when 9/11 happened, they would fly out, they would call on me because I'm a certified. Yeah. And we would go to the scene and we're prepared to deal with whatever the emotion is in that moment. And then I'll get the person out of what we call the emergency space into a safe place emotionally. Right. Yes. And so some people are not ready when you go to them. Right. That's okay.
Okay.
We have to be okay with that.
Right.
I can't counsel you if you don't want to be counseled. I can't give you steps and tools and a roadmap if you don't want to start walking.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. And now it's not always now that's the time. Okay, so the
Exactly.
funeral's over now, let's go. Okay, so we're going to take a break. And when we come back, I would like to talk more about stages and steps of people not being ready. Like you went to the house a year later and the watch is still there. And I know someone like that who didn't want to move anything.
Yep.
Even like the linen on the bed, didn't want to move that because it would mean that this is real.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
We're talking today about managing grief here on Grownfolk Talk with Patrice. My guest is Dr. Gina Spence-Virgil, and we will be back to talk some more about it.